Hello, and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. It is your host, the Union, and in this one we have several advances by the Russians and a single advance by the Ukrainians. The Russians have advanced in the western parts of the Ukrainian Kursk incursion, regaining some territory in the Kursk region. In the Kupiansk direction, the Russians have expanded their foothold across the Oska River line, while the Ukrainians have managed to recapture Kupiansk, the eastern parts of it, pushing the Russians out of the city. In the meantime, the Russians have managed to advance further in the northern and southern flanks of Kurova, within the settlement itself and near Velika Novoselivka. Starting out in the south, the Russians have managed to advance towards Velika Novoselivka, capturing the hourglass fortified position just east of the settlement. With this, the Russians have full control over all of the fortified positions east of Velika Novoselivka, and the Russians will likely focus their forces in the direction of Rostolne, where they have advanced further to gain control over the supply lines and the northern flank of Velika Novoselivka. The Russian advance within Rostolne captures the eastern parts of the settlement, where the fighting has now moved on to the central parts, with the Russians capturing the post office, marking their entrance into the central parts. The Ukrainians are now pushed back to the western parts, and as we can see, the western part is much smaller than that of the eastern parts, and the Ukrainians will be pushed out towards their fortified positions west of the settlement, from which the Russians will look to gain control of it and move down further south along the road towards Novoselivka. We also see that the Ukrainians have anti-tank ditches and dragon teeth fortifications north of Rostolne, which actually works against their favor in the defense of Velika Novoselivka, considering the fact that the Russians now stand in between the Ukrainian positions and Velika Novoselivka. As long as the Russians do not intend on going further north, the Ukrainians would actually be limited in going south through these fortified positions. If they reveal any gaps, the Russians can take advantage of those. Otherwise, the Ukrainians will have to force their way through the northwestern parts, where they will be clashing against the Russians near Novoselivka, and the Russians can use the river line in the western parts and anti-tank ditches and dragon teeth in the northern parts as defensive lines to siege Velika Novoselivka itself. Fighting continues in the western flank as well, where the objective of the Russians is to cut off those supply lines to and from Velika Novoselivka, to siege Velika Novoselivka itself, and operationally encircle the settlement, which would be forced to resupply through the dirt roads in between that of Velika Novoselivka and Borilatske in the western direction. Towards Kurova, the Russians have advanced northwest of Delnya, capturing some of the fortified positions and flanking Kurova itself by moving along the fortified lines outside of the settlement. While within the settlement itself, the Russians have managed to capture the farm areas in the eastern parts of it, and have managed to reach the apartment complex area in the central parts of Kurova. With this geolocated footage, we can see both the Russian advances to the south of Kurova and within Kurova itself, both of which shows that the Ukrainian defenses near Kurova are at a breaking point. If the Russians gain control over the apartment complex buildings, the Ukrainians would have to withdraw to the industrial zone, which was the final out of 4 zones of Kurova, where the Russians will gain control over the other 3. This will leave the settlement of Kurova itself practically in Russian hands, where a siege over the industrial zone will commence. And with the Russian advances in the northern flank as well, they may be able to completely cut off the remaining Ukrainian forces that would have withdrawn to the industrial zone. At the same time, positional fighting continues to the south of the river line, here south of Kurova, as well as to the north of Hanivka and Romanivka, where the Russians are attempting to close the pocket. What we'll be seeing over the next couple of weeks is the Russians moving along the river line, capturing settlement after settlement, while at the same time moving through Kurova, gaining full control over the city, and in the northern flank, flanking Kurova itself, and moving to connect all 3 of these sections of the front line for a combined push together towards Andrivka and Konstantinopel. The Russians will be connecting 3 separate groups of forces that are fighting near Kurova, the flank south of Kurova and the flank north of Kurova, for a combined push. Kurova is also the final settlement here in the south, which has had these fortified positions prepared over a long time. The defenses near Pokrovsk were prepared since 2015. The remaining defenses and fortifications were prepared at the start of the war and since then. This means that Kurova is the final 2014-2015 line of defense for the Ukrainians in the entire section, besides that of the Kupiansk-Konstantinivka line, and this further improves the Russian positions. The Russians have aligned their front line somewhat near Berezki, where they are slowly advancing along the fields and forest lines north of the settlement, as well as to the west of Yurivka. The Russians are advancing along the fields and forest lines towards Pushkine. The Russians are continuing with positional fighting in the area between Pokrovsk in the north and Kurova in the south, to gain control over the main highway and the fortified positions aligned with it, to allow the Russians to, once they reach Andreevka, to quickly make their way up towards Pokrovsk, and having control over the highways from Donetsk towards Pokrovsk, the Russians would have additional supply lines going between the two. There is the main highway to the south of Donetsk, which goes through Merinka, through Kurova, and over to Andreevka. This can then be connected towards Pokrovsk to the north. While at the same time, there's the highway going through Vesele, Iski, and so on, through Selidove and up towards Pokrovsk. And then there's the railways that goes through Avdiivka, through Cheretsine, and then up towards Pokrovsk. These are the three supply lines the Russians will be making use of during the siege of Pokrovsk, which will very likely begin here in December. December will be a very important month in this war, as the Russians will gain control over Kurahove. They'll likely also gain control over Velika Novoselivka, and the siege of Pokrovsk will begin with a Russian capture over the southern edges of Donetsk region and reaching the Dnipropetrovsk region and Zaporizhia region from the east and south. Moving on to the Kupiansk section of the front line, the Ukrainians have managed to push the Russians out of the city, pushing them out towards the field where the fortified positions remain under Russian control, and heavy fighting continues in the Kupiansk direction. However, the Russians were unable to hold on to their foothold within the settlement itself and were pushed out. Now, the second development taking place in this area is the Russian foothold, which is currently expanding across the Uskar River line. What this means is that one of two possibilities can be true. Either the push towards Kupiansk was a feint to allow the Russians to make this crossing across the Uskar River line and develop it further, or it was a real operation, however it simply failed. In either case, Russians are now taking advantage of the situation to gain this foothold across, where they will be pressuring the Ukrainian positions near Novoselivka, as well as Devorishna, where the objective of the Russians will be to establish a foothold across the Uskar River line and develop offensive operations in this direction, to allow the Russians to gain an advantage here near the Uskar River line, from which they can develop offensive operations either from the Russian border across the Uskar River line towards Devorishna, to develop it further towards flanking Kupiansk south, or to simply spread out the Ukrainian forces from the Kupiansk direction into a wider section of the front line. There are a lot of possibilities as to what the Russian objective is with the foothold across the Uskar River line. But what we will see is that wherever the Russians go, a lot of fighting follows. So the Ukrainians will have to redirect forces to deal with this river crossing here near the Uskar River. In the Kursk direction, the Russians have managed to capture the fortified positions south of Zelenizhlyakh. This is confirmed with the geolocated footage of Russian armored vehicles dropping off Russian infantry near the fortified positions, where they then pick up positions along them. With this, the Russians are slowly pushing through to gain control of the fortified positions. They've successfully pushed back the Ukrainians from their storming of Novoselivka. Donetsk remains under Ukrainian control, so there's some positional fighting there as well. But the main push of the Russians is now moving towards Svetlikovo from the western and northern directions. We'll see the Russians continue developing their Kursk counteroffensive, while the Ukrainians hold on to their positions and try to improve them every day. All in all, what we can see as a general trend of the front line is that the Russians have the overwhelming advantage. However, the Ukrainians still have elite units that can successfully launch offensive operations, counteroffensive operations, or generally improve the frontline positions of the Ukrainians. However, they also largely consist of non-elite units which simply can't do anything by themselves other than slow down the Russian forces. And this is not a sustainable situation for the Ukrainians, as they are simply not able to develop a large enough elite force to deal with the Russian army. The Russians have a much larger army at this point compared to the Ukrainians. They're able to utilize their numerical superiority to fight through the Ukrainian fortified positions, taking control of them one after another, and with a lot more experience from all of the fighting that has taken place within Ukraine, the Russian army has also become much more skilled than it has over the past few years. So the more time goes by, the Russian army grows larger and more skilled, while the Ukrainians heavily rely on these elite forces, which come and go as they are used as soon as they arrive, whether they are equipped with equipment or trained with foreign training. In the end, they are sent to the front line to fight battles which are really unsustainable, to say the least. And that's going to be all for this update. Thank you for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon and YouTube membership for additional content. Thank you for watching and have a great day.